We should move on from the suffragettes, but actually it does actually stay on a theme. Who had the Daily Worker? I think it was someone around here. Did anyone have the Daily Worker?
No? Well, we had the Daily Worker. We can't really just start on it because we also had the British Worker.
Okay, let's look at the British Worker. Let's look at the British Worker,
which does come first chronologically. So, the British Worker is the official paper of the trade union movement during the general strike, and we focused on the main article there in the middle, where it's a rebuttal of government claims, basically, that they're holding the country to ransom and so on. So what was pointed out here was interesting, is that there's no pretense, like you get in mainstream media, of balance or neutrality.
That's allegiance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's their comment. Yeah. I think one of the history and the general strike was called in support of the miners, right?
The miners were actually locked out. They weren't on strike at first. They were locked out by the employers.
And my reading of what went on then was that the General Council was rather ineffectual in the way in which it prosecuted its business. You know, there was an opportunity, a political opportunity there, which it didn't seize, because I think there were enough people on the General Council who thought that trade unions didn't get into politics, basically. They were just into collective bargaining, and that's as far as their remit went.
Do you think we need to rewind just a little bit and just do a couple of sentences on what was the general strike of 1926? And then we'll get on to British Worker, which either you could do, or I'm sure at least a few people in the out here. Does someone want to do two sentences on what was the general strike of 1926? Does anyone feel confident? Okay, Alain.
Well, like I said, it arose out of a long and bitter struggle within the coal mining industry. But I think the important thing about it was that this was a general strike that was seen as secondary strike action in support of the miners to try and win what was regarded as their just demands. And I think it showed up all sorts of weaknesses within the trade union movement. There were some parts of the trade union movement, particularly the rail unions, for example, who were particularly effective at making the strike work. There are other parts of the trade union movement which seem to be virtually indifferent to what was going on.
Yes. So back to the radical media piece. Is it helpful if we stand back? Is it okay if we stand forward? Can you see over here? Are you? Yeah. Okay. So something I think is really interesting about looking for media from the time of the general strike in Britain is how little media there is from the normal sources. So at the library you've got the transcript of the radio transmissions from the time, but even they say kind of this is a really skeletal service because hardly anybody's working. Now, if I remember rightly, the Times managed to print out one sheet of paper during the time. So essentially, the only places that you could get your news from during the general strike was the workers' paper and the government paper.
Yeah, there were also sort of duplicated sheets that were produced by small groups of workers around the country, but they were of a very local character. It was only really the British Worker that gave a national picture from a worker's point of view. That's the really, that's the real point.
But a really interesting thing when you go through and you can read kind of day one of the strike, what the government paper said, what the union paper said, was you can read the conversations going on between them. And the unions are accused of this being a political strike. And the British Worker comes out with, no, it's not a political strike, it's just about kind of these specific pay and conditions in this specific place. But of course, for many of the people involved, it was a political strike. As some people then and after have said, the question was, who rules Britain? And for a week or so at least, it was the unions and the workers that ruled Britain, rather than the ruling class.
But it has to be said that what was going to actually step into that political vacuum from the workers' point of view. It wasn't like as if there was a revolutionary government in waiting that got everything set up, just waiting to take over once they got rid of the government who was there.
Yeah.
So you have a similar. Well, this isn't the first time that this sort of thing has happened. In 1832 and 1837 and 42, there were various efforts on the part of the Chartist movement to bring about a general strike, to create that sort of vacuum of power, so that they could bring in a proper working class government. And the National Convention of the National Charter Association, it's the proper name of the Chartists, they saw themselves as the revolutionary government in waiting, and they actually used to hold their meetings at the same time as Parliament to emphasise the fact that they were the legitimate government of the day. Because, of course, there was no way at that time that Parliament properly represented the majority of the population, because most people didn't have the vote.
Yeah. Okay. Are we feeling? We've got a bit like. Are we feeling kind of? Do we need like a quick kind of stand up and stretch, or shall we just keep plowing on? Do you want a 30-second stand up and stretch? Right, 30 seconds to stand up and stretch.
Am I in the way? Kind of. Yeah.
Smile. Yeah, you can sit down and stretch. You can lie down and stretch.
There are more secrets about the library here, depending on the interest.
I'd like to think of political reasons. Good. I mean, you didn't like the answer. Okay, alright, sit down. So, at the back you had two newspapers called Black Dwarf from very different times. And I was wondering what your reflections on what they were and why they were and what they made you think were. That's very background. Anyway, it was that group at the back, wasn't it?
Well, we read out the one of 1817, and basically what it's saying is that the struggle continues, that we can't just sit down and celebrate what our ancestors did and what our ancestors accomplished with constitution and stuff like that we have to keep going.
Yeah, that seems like a good message through history. And how did you think that compared to the other one?
We can actually have time to discuss.
Did you think it was the same newspaper that had carried on for 200 and something years? Well, it's not. Anyway. Okay, any more reflections on that? Okay, Alain, do you want to?
Well, okay. I think one of the important things about this particular article out of Black Dwarf is that even in those days they recognised that Britain doesn't have a written constitution, right? That what we have is a ragbag of all sorts of things which, together with various traditional practices, approximates to a constitution, a way of running the country. This is by contrast with France and with more particularly America, which has a written constitution. And I think this is the sort of subtext behind what is said here, is that basically what we should be working towards is a constitution, a written constitution where people know exactly what their rights are.
So how does that differ from this?
Well, it's a shame we can't turn it around, but is that possible?
No.
No, okay. Well, do I have to say who these people are? This is Richard Nixon, and that's Harold Wilson. Right? And this is the getting towards the end of the Vietnam War. And basically, the left in this country were vilifying the way in which Harold Wilson gave his sort of tacit support for for the war in Vietnam. They didn't openly support it, but they didn't actually do much to try and stop the Americans from tearing the Vietnam people apart. And that's what's happening there.
So some of the editors of Black Dwarf are people who will be known to you, and maybe you even know who the editors were yourself. Anyone want to stick up your hand? Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting that Tariq Ali consciously took the name of Black Dwarf from the old, the 1817 newspaper. He had that historical perspective, right? So, yeah.
Tariq Ali, a little story out of Tariq Ali's autobiography. So I said before that kind of when radical newspapers start annoying the establishment starts fighting back. I think this happened with Black Dwarf. In his autobiography, he talks about a time when a group of people came to stay at the office, stayed overnight, and when they stayed overnight, they drew on the wall a picture of how to make a bomb. And he arrived in the office in the morning, and he was like, "Bloody hell! Someone's drawn how to make a bomb on the wall." So he went and he put a big poster over the top of it. And I was like, "Oh, that's fine, that's fine." Later that same day, there was a police raid on the offices, and they went straight to this poster and they took it down. So kind of different ways are found to suppress when people get radical ideas out there. And it's been different through history, whether that's been advertising companies trademarking radical media or other means. I'm conscious that we've got a couple to go through, and we've got a question, yeah?
Just a quick question about Black Dwarf. It wasn't a continuous publication then over that entire period?
No, not at all, no. Like I say, the only reason why I got that name was because Tariq Ali and some of the other people had an historical perspective. They knew about the history of the radical press, right? Yeah. And they picked that name out of that history.
So like the Correspondence Society drawing on the history of the landers and the diggers?
Yeah. And that's a really important point. I think that one of the great resources of the movement, if I can call it that, is that historical perspective. You know, there are lots of lessons to be learned from the past, right? Including what not to do in the present and the future. And it's all there. You know, it's amazing how it survived as well. Sometimes by a very, very slender thread. You know, it's just been just a few people who've kept these ideas alive, and it's been passed on, you know, to future generations. It's a culture. And that culture needs to be transmitted, right?
I'm keen to. Oops! Oh no! Don't want to talk about that. There's also Searchlight and Sanity, which we don't have up here, but which I handed out. So, could someone? I handed out the first edition of Searchlight.
Yeah, Searchlight. Yeah.
The front cover. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. This paper, Searchlight. The date is in the spring of 1965. So we're looking at more than 15, to me 20 years really. The headlines here, The Truth About the Fascists. I suppose it's a publication that sort of came out to sort of explain to the British people at large why the so-called coloured immigrants at that time were coming to the country itself. This is because all these sort of problems that Britain was facing around that sort of period was put squarely blamed onto the immigrants coming through by right-wing, sort of extreme right-wing groups, particularly sort of fascist groups, you know, and so forth. And I suppose that this was trying to sort of bring awareness to the British people at large as to the situation. And so forth. And so what they did was, on the first part, they sort of gave you sort of an insight into the background of fascists, how they came about and so forth, and what their aims are, and so forth. And then there's some sort of, on the next page, some facts about coloured workers, you know, why they came here, and so forth. And generally explaining that they were invited here to come to help build the country and et cetera, et cetera. and just giving you some sort of statistics, you know, of their population, which is very, very small, you know, like sort of 2% of the population and so forth, which is particularly exploited and blown up by the fascists. That's what we got out of that.
That was pretty good.
Yeah, you know, the battle goes on, and that just when you think the fascists have disappeared under the floorboards, they come out again. So be on your guard, you know.
And just okay.
I just want to point out who is all of the people behind Searchlight?
I'm afraid we've got there. Don't know.
We've got to move on quickly, but I did hand out an early edition of Sanity, the CND magazine. Could you just wave that in the air? I handed it out to you guys in the middle. Oh no, I think it was... I handed you... Yes, there it is. Could you just wave that? Hi, hi, hi. Show it round. There we go. So, yeah, I mean, nowadays and always an important... Yeah, I imagine there's lots of people who subscribe to those or write in those. I'd say as somebody who looks back, please do keep them. And please do write the date on. Sometimes they don't have the dates written on them, and you can't necessarily tell when it's from. And we've got some more of those around the place as well. We've got a copy of Action around the place, which is the WDM one. And of course, Peace News, if I'm right, started as Peace Pledge Union. No, it pre-existed Peace Pledge Union, isn't it?
It was independent, then it became
there we go.
the Organ of Peace Pledge.
Can you give us a 1 minute on history of Peace News?
Oh my God, that's... Well, it started in 1936 with a small reading group in Wood Green, and they thought that they wanted to make a paper that was of service to the peace movement in the 1930s, sort of, you know, the interwar peace movement was very, very large, and people were very frightened of a Second World War happening. And it was really came out of a lot of people who were in the First World War or who were affected by the First World War. And so it had a sort of anti-militarist stance, but also it had quite an anti-imperialism analysis of why the wars were happening. So it started sort of specifically as a pacifist paper that, and it's after about 3 weeks, it was coming out weekly, after about 3 weeks, the Peace Pledge Union, which had just started as an anti-war pledge not to fight in the next war, sort of took it on as their paper. And it went through various changes over the last 75 years, but in the 50s it was very much part of the anti-nuclear movement, and sort of the first Aldermaston marches were organised from Peace News Office, etc. And it then split from the PPU because because there was an argument about nuclear weapons, and that the PPU just wanted to focus on anti-war. They didn't think the method of killing people was necessarily important. So then there was this divergence. And by sort of the 60s, early 70s, it was, well, I suppose all the way through, but it became more interested in possible futures and new societies and stuff. So a lot of the coverage in the 60s and 70s was about a different sort of world, and a non-militarist world. And then the big sort of heyday of the 80s was coinciding with the anti-nuclear movement of the 80s. But the highest, the biggest distribution of Peace News was sort of 40,000 plus during the Second World War. And then at that point, the printer was too scared to print the paper, and so it was typeset and printed by Eric Gill for a couple of weeks, and people distributed by bicycle and handing out neighbour to neighbour and stuff, and that was actually the peak of distribution. So, and if anybody wants to look at old Peace Newses, we've got bound copies of the last 75 years in King's Cross, above Houseman's Bookshop, so you're very welcome to come in.
Lightning talk about history of Peace News. That's brilliant. So we've got 6 or 7 minutes left, and I think it would be bad to leave this room without thinking about, well, why is all this important? We've told some great anecdotes. We've looked at how some newspapers have kind of contributed to some movements. But I think there's something bigger than that, and perhaps something more theoretical than that. This is an hourglass, or this is my attempt to draw an hourglass. And like broadly defined, I'd say there's lots of information out there, and there's lots of people to receive it. But in general, that information gets kind of funneled through a very small bit in the middle of the hourglass. And if, as they usually do, the people with power control the middle of the hourglass, then that means that it's really difficult to get information out there. It's really difficult to make change happen. I think there's two approaches that social movements and radical activists and radical journalists could take. One is to try and be the middle, to kind of seize the middle, and one is to just, ignore the middle and just do it anyway. And I think the really important thing about radical media, alternative media, rebellious media, is that it does empower us just to talk straight to people, and that really scares the people who usually control the flow of information. I don't know if anything's
yeah, I'd agree wholeheartedly with that. The one thing which I didn't include in this material from the working class movement library, which I wish I had included, is that all the things that you've seen have been properly published, periodicals of one sort or another. But we've got a whole load of stuff which is the sort of a samizdat of its time, right? The thing that springs to mind particularly is that we've got a collection of things called pit and factory papers, which were produced on those sort of Gestetner type duplicated, right? And these would have been, you would have had a communist cell in a particular coal mine, right? There's one that comes to mind from somewhere in Northumberland, I think. And it has the wonderful name of the Thorn Butty Crusher. Right? And a butty wasn't something that you ate. It was a coal miner's official who was in the mine and who you detested, right? And the idea was that if you were lucky, you managed to crush him with one of the coal trucks. That sort of class opposition. But that was just one pit that had this pit paper, right? And it's produced by the miners, just duplicated. But we've got stuff that was produced in 1968 by during the time of the student occupation in LSE. It's those sort of local, immediate things. They're the things which don't often survive. The things that are published nationally, there's a much better chance of those surviving. Right? So really, it's if anybody has any doubts about the way in which living through an event like student occupation or a strike or anything like that, I think that has a permanent impact on the way that someone views the world, radicalises them forever, one way or another, right? They're never going to be the same person again.
I think on that point, as we approach the end, I'd want to kind of throw in a word of warning in that obviously this whole conference has been about radical media, this session has been about radical media, but radical media alone doesn't make change happen. Because with media we can only win the argument, and the difference between winning arguments and winning campaigns, we all learned that with Iraq. There's many other campaigns through history that we can look at where the argument has been won, but the campaign hasn't. But an important part of winning campaigns is winning the argument, is getting the information out there. But in order to really win, I think we need to really find other ways and different ways of challenging the interests of the establishment of elites. So, just writing blogs won't be enough.
Again, the radical media of the past has got lots of interesting ideas, about how you can exercise economic power, for example. The whole idea of preferential buying. The Chartists set up Chartist stores where working people bought all their goods from cooperative Chartist stores and didn't support the local shopkeepers who were the toadies to the Tories. Right? It's that sort of economic power.